Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast. Today, I share your biggest takeaways from the top 10 most downloaded interviews of 2019. So let's get into it.
Welcome to the Beginner Photography Podcast, a weekly podcast for those who believe that moments matter most and that a beautiful photo is more than just a sum of its settings. A show for those who want to do more with the gear they have to take better photos today. And now, your host, Raymond Hatfield.
Welcome to this episode of the Beginner Photography Podcast. This is it. This is the last episode of the year, the last episode of 2019. And I couldn't be more excited for this one because this is a mega interview. I had decided to take the top 10 most downloaded interviews of 2019 and create this episode of your biggest takeaways. So here's what this episode is. I looked at all the numbers, compiled the list of the top 10 most downloaded interviews, and what's interesting is what I loved seeing was how different they all are. Every episode is entirely different, a different genre. There's wedding photography, landscapes, family, street, food, travel, podcasts of gear, storytelling, and even how to become more creative. I think that this may be the most diverse set of photographers as far as skill sets go, and there truly is so much to learn in this episode right here. So what I did after I had this list of the top 10 most downloaded interviews of 2019, I reached out to the premium members to ask them to embark on a top secret classified mission. And once accepted, I assigned an interview for them to listen to. In return, all I wanted was to know their number one takeaway. And you know what I got back? This made me so happy. Tons of takeaways. It wasn't just one. It wasn't that somebody would just reply back and be like, oh yeah, that thing he said about, this or whatever. It was an entire list of multiple takeaways from everyone. Now, maybe I shouldn't be surprised, but I was. I take a lot of time to prepare for each interview, and I hope to find a good blend between asking questions that I truly want to know at my skill level while keeping them from being too complex, and hearing your feedback. Your personal takeaways just blew me away. So if you can have one takeaway per interview, you're going to make huge steps forward in your photography. And right here, this is the culmination of takeaways from 10 interviews. So, as I said, really excited to get into this. But before I do, I want to take a moment to personally thank everyone who helped you make this episode possible, which is all the premium members. We got Derek, Ross, Kim, Michael, Mara, Scott, Ashley, Arias, and then all the other listeners who volunteered to help as well. There was Emily, Saul, Amanda, Sean, Jim, Magda, and Omar. You all have shown me this year that there is someone, out there on the other end of this microphone that I'm speaking into right now who is listening, and I thank you for that. So with that, I'm not going to waste any more time. Let us get into this massive compilation episode. So the first interview snippet that I have here is from episode 131 with Valerie Jardine. And I asked Jim from the Facebook group to give me his biggest takeaway. And what Jim said was, after listening to Valerie on the podcast, my biggest takeaway is simply patience. I think we're all conditioned through society to want results as fast as possible. Our employers want reports, our kids want the newest toy right away, etc. We live in a now society. And I think a lot of photographers are the same way. I know a lot of times I'll quick look at a subject and move on if I'm not excited about it immediately. Listening to Valerie's podcast made me realize I need to slow down, take things in more often, let things come to me in time. It's so important to look at things from all angles, not just one glance and move on. She is teaching me patience is the key. And even sometimes when you're patient and you have everything set up and you have your idea plans, they aren't always successful. You have to be ready to say, I tried this idea and it didn't work. It's time to call it quits for the day, regroup, reorganize, and attack it again tomorrow. Jim, great takeaway. That is a really solid advice to take away from this episode, and I'm really glad that Valerie was able to share that. So let's get into that snippet with Valerie right now. What would you say overall, though, is the job description of a street photographer?
Well, it's really recording everyday life, and it's not just. There's also the misconception of, well, it's just people walking across the street. Well, no, it's not. You have to be really discerning. You have to be extremely discerning, and that's one thing that most street photographers at first they're not discerning. It's like, okay, there's somebody moving. There's a street. There's a subject. Like, and it's like, well, what was interesting about that person? I mean, no offense, but there is nothing there. It's a boring subject wearing boring clothes and with a boring backdrop. I mean, you have to have a lot of elements come together. That's why it's so difficult, because you only have control over your vision and your gear. You have control over nothing that's happening on the street. I never stage anything. I mean, it's always 100% candid. I do. I sometimes, and I always explain to my students, you always have to go for a story first. The backdrop may not be the best, the light may not be the best, but if you have a beautiful moment, a beautiful story, you have something. If you have a great background and you ruin it with a boring subject, you have nothing. So sometimes all the elements will come together, but that happens a few times in a lifetime of a photographer. So I think it's always resetting their expectations, especially if they've been doing other genres of photography, such as landscape, where they actually can take their time. They're on a tripod. They can come back. Here you have a fraction of a second to immortalize something that's never happened and will never happen again. That's it. That's all you have. So you have to move really, really quickly. You have to think quickly, and you have to let go of the notion of perfection, which is difficult for a lot of photographers who've are experiencing other genres of photography. It's that notion of perfection, because in street photography, it's usually the imperfection that creates an emotional response.
Wow. That's going to be a memorable quote from this episode right there. That was
Okay,
good. That was good. So I'm still trying to kind of wrap my head, wrap my head around street photography a little bit as a wedding photographer and somebody who doesn't shoot street. Can you walk me through how you go about shooting street? You said that you don't plan anything out. You don't create anything. You don't interact with it. So when you decide to go out, do you walk out of the house with a specific photo in mind, or is it all up to just being in the right place at the right time and hoping that you get something? And if you don't, well, at least you weren't behind a desk all day.
That's right. No, actually, so first, if you have a specific picture in mind, that's somebody else's shot. So it's not yours. If you have a specific image in mind that you've seen, probably something you've seen, then it's not yours. And so I try not to. But then once I'm on a location, I usually hit the street depends on the light. So I'll follow the light if I have some interesting light, like a lot of light and shadows. So that will probably be what I'm going to follow first. If it's an overcast day, I'm going to have to get closer to people and be more in tune with expressions and gesture, because I have nothing in the light that's going to be exciting. So it's a little more difficult. When you have light, harsh light, you're going to make more exciting photographs no matter what. It's easier then. If you have overcast condition and you don't have the spectacular, dramatic light to save you, like harsh shadows and harsh light shafts and so forth, then you're going to have to work a little harder. So I like to be surprised. That said, I do have several projects that I always have in the back of my mind. I have a project about street dogs. I have a project about stories of hands. which is only getting close to people's hands. So I'm always looking
Wow.
for hands that are doing something different. I shoot within inches from people. So if I'm at a market or a busy area, I'll focus on that because I'm more of a minimalist photographer. So if it's crowded, I'll probably focus on something specific and work on a project. But I don't go with a picture in mind. But once I'm at a location, for example, I find this really amazing shaft of light and I know I only have minutes because that light is going to disappear, then I will visualize what would make the strongest possible shot. And it may or may not happen, but I'm not going to settle. If the perfect subject doesn't come through that light before that light disappears, I'm not going to get the shot. I prefer not get the shot than get a mediocre shot. And that's something that takes a long time to discipline yourself to do. A lot of time there's this amazing backdrop, and then I see my students, I point out the backdrop and I'll usually work with them one-on-one or two of them at a time when we're in a interesting area, and I go back and forth to them and point things out, and they see this amazing backdrop, and then they grab a picture, and I said, well, wait, what did you take a picture of? So, well, yeah, look, there was somebody came through. I'm like, okay, this is a person with uninteresting clothes with a backpack, which creates kind of not a very elegant subject, and really nothing. If the light hits their face, it doesn't hit the face; it'll hit the back of their head or something. So the light was good, the background is good, but you settled for an interesting subject. I said, no, you stay longer. You have 10 more minutes of that light here. In 10 minutes, somebody much better, much more fitting for that environment may come through. If you're in Paris or Rome, you're not going to photograph a tourist, right? You're going to photograph somebody who belongs in that spot. So it's really about being discerning. That's why your rate of success is so low. But I prefer coming home with 10 pictures on my card, that actually 10 pictures that I want to look at, than 500 and then trash 490 of them, because that's pretty much what it's going to be on a good day. If you come back with one picture you actually want to keep, that's really good. And people have to be comfortable with that. And that's difficult for photographers. I mean, some of my colleagues actually ask their students to take 100 pictures and delete 99 of them, and be that specific. It's a good exercise, actually. So
Wow. So wait until you get home to delete those 99 photos? Here we have Nick Church from episode 136. If you are in the Facebook group, you will know that Nick is a pretty active guy in the Beginner Photography Podcast Facebook group and is extremely helpful. So it was no surprise that this episode really stuck out to a lot of you listeners. So I asked Catherine and I asked Kimberly for their thoughts on this episode, and here's what they had to say. So I've listened to this episode several times. I really enjoyed this episode because it brings to life the reality of hard work and perseverance. When hard work meets talent, you get Nick Church. He had a lot of valuable information to share, but many things he said, such as gear isn't the most important thing, is also shared in so many other interviews. So to choose something specific to this interview, I would have to say that my biggest takeaway is that nothing is just handed out. You have to put yourself out there in order to get somewhere. Nick discusses how he would go into a random local coffee shop and ask if he could hang his prints. He would also just photograph local buildings local building processes from start to finish and get recognized on TV and papers for his charitable work. From there, he was asked to photograph paid shoots. Yeah, I mean, what a progression, what a road that Nick Church went on. And Catherine and Kimberly, I thank you so much for sharing your biggest takeaway. Let's go ahead and listen on into that part with Nick Church right now. Because I think that your story is unique, going from picking up a camera one day and then within 24 months being able to leave a full-time job, which as I've read online, was a pretty good job. So knowing that it's more than just wedding photography is going to help a lot of listeners. So before we get into that, I want you to take me back to 2013, right? You had never picked up a camera.
2014, yeah.
What were you doing, and how did you get your start in photography?
Well, it was I've always been into art, so I've always been, had a creative outlet, and that's either been music or art, creating pen and ink drawings and things like that. The career that I had was in the software industry, and since moving from being a software architect and software engineer, which is quite a creative job, bizarrely, because you're creating software designs and so on, moving into management, that I found that extremely dry, and I needed to have this sort of creative side as well. It was purely that I was doing quite a lot of traveling with work, so I was going to the Middle East, going to the Far East, and I wanted to take some pictures so that I could draw them when I got back. Some just different things to draw. So I bought a Micro Four Thirds camera, just an Olympus, and I thought, right, better read how this works. Then I had no idea about so it was on automatic mode. So I thought, right, on the flight, I worked out how that worked, and just worked out the things that I didn't know. So I didn't know what aperture meant. I didn't know how that affected depth of field. I didn't know how the sensor reacted to different lights, and just so that was a few months of just learning about that, because I want to. The way that I tend to learn is to do a deep dive straight away and just get from the ground up. So I'm not one of these people that could just put it into mode X and just start shooting. I'd want to know what that mode is. What have I just done to the camera that's different from mode Y? And that was it. So I was suddenly found that the process of taking those pictures was actually a lot more immediate for a start than going home drawing them. But it was just something I really loved doing. And it was when I came back to the UK after that trip, I started shooting just scenes around my local city, Bristol, in the UK. People said, "Hey, these are pretty good. These you should exhibit these." So I did that, and before I knew it, I was just doing some exhibitions in cafes, some galleries, took some stuff in, and I was selling a bit of work, and that was an amazing feeling, just to be able to, when someone comes along with 20 quid, sort of $25 equivalent, and says, "Yeah, we really like that. We'll give you some money for it," and to be rewarded financially for something that you love to create, and it was a creative process, is amazing. But a couple of people that did that also then said, "Do you shoot weddings?" Which I've never shied away for a challenge, so I said yes, absolutely. And then thought, right, I better work out how I'd actually shoot a wedding pretty quickly. I had about 9 months or so to do that, and so just spent that 9 months really working out what the difference is between shooting a nice church that stays nice and still, or a sunset that stays pretty still, and loads of stuff happening at a wedding where you only get one chance. And so that was kind of interesting learning that process. But I think it was after that first wedding, delivering those photos back and seeing their reaction. I haven't looked at the photos for a while, so I'm not sure if I don't think I dare look at it now. But to see that reaction, I thought, wow, that this is the most rewarded I felt for years, and I thought, right, I've got, I was toying with the idea. Could I do this? Am I good enough to be able to do that? Could I build up the business to do it? And my son, who was 10 at the time, was listening. I was boring him to tears with this, and he said, just do it. What's there to lose? And I said, well, there's a career that I've had for 20 years. There's our house, but all those things. He said, well, you can always go back to it. And I thought that's quite hard to argue with, that kind of logic of a 10-year-old. So that's what I did. I thought, right, what would I need to do to get from where I am now to a position that I could leave my current role without being irresponsible to my family and, us all being on the streets, and just set the plan in motion. So had that as a target.
So later on, you said that when you got back from that trip, you had a few photos, you started shooting around Bristol, and then you said one thing led to another, and then I was doing exhibitions and selling prints.
Yeah,
there's something in between there. There's something in between the, hey, I took a photo and now I'm selling prints. So when you say that you're doing exhibitions and putting in coffee shops, was that, you had a full-time job at this point. Was that on purpose that would you just approach coffee shops and
absolutely
ask to put up prints?
Yeah, absolutely. So that I'm a real believer that apart from maybe 1 or 2% of people are going to get someone come up to them and say, hey, we're going to give you this fantastic opportunity for no apparent reason that you've not earned. That just doesn't happen to most of us. So for the rest of us, it's legwork, and effort, and that is really tough when you have family and you've got a full-time job. It's tough to be able to put the amount of time in that you need. So what I realized was, all right, I've got these photos. I want to be rewarded for this. I want to get that feedback from people buying this, or at least appreciating it if not buying it. So that was quite a drive. I thought, right, where can I do that? So I had a list of things I could do, which was contact all the art galleries around my city, all the coffee shops. I thought all this wall space in cafes, and as it turns out, they will bite your arm off if there's a local photographer with some free artwork they're going to put on the wall. Loads of them said, and in the end, I just had to just pick a selection because they all pretty much wanted it. And so,
what was it that you were hoping to get out of that?
Sorry?
What was it that you were hoping to get out of displaying your photos in a coffee shop? Was it sales, or was it just recognition?
Yeah, recognition and sales. I think you can, with the advantage I've got of having had a career in business and in software where you have to do lots of marketing, and if you're going to do anything, you have to have a brand and you have to start growing that brand and making it a thing. And I think when we start out, it isn't a thing. It's just whether it's your name or whatever you call it, that's just what you've called it. As soon as it people see it on the wall, they see it on Facebook, they see it on your website, they see it on a business card, it's becoming something that is tangible then. And I think that's all part of it. And I'm not sure I was really making some big intention to think, right, I'm going to get my name across this group of this part of Bristol through the coffee shop. I just knew that if I was going to do anything other than just enjoy my own photography, then I was going to have to start pushing my work out there. And it is pushing, people aren't going to come and knock on your door and ask for it. You have to
right.
Even
though that's what everybody wants. Everybody thinks that about a website too. I think that's one of the main things I hear. Like in episode 137, I interviewed well-known landscape photographer Andy Mumford. So I asked Ross for his input on this one, and he said, my biggest takeaway from this episode with Andy Mumford was, quote, every photographer fails more than they succeed. Ross says, we just bought a new house, so I was listening while painting some walls, and when I heard Andy say that, it stopped me in my tracks. I tend to be pretty tough on myself and expect greatness. So to hear him say this, it really made me realize that it's okay to come away from a shoot that I'm not in love with. Yeah, that is something, that's like a fundamental change in your photography. And what's great is that this has nothing to do with settings. It has nothing to do with settings. It is that bigger picture. It is the idea of photography, and that is where you are learning and growing here, Ross. So excited. That is such a great takeaway. I think that's one of my favorite takeaways as well. So let's go ahead and listen in to Andy's words right here. You talk a lot about on YouTube about the importance of failure, right? Can you share a personal failure that you faced while shooting landscape photography and how it affected you?
I don't know. Yeah, it's not. There are just so many stories rather than one in particular. It's you very often, I was in Norway a few weeks ago, and you can very often shoot something and you get so involved in the process of being there that you then come back and you look at the images and you think, if I'd stood a meter to the right. So I think it's rather than being disheartened from that, it's the kind of, okay, next time I need to be more aware. I've had so many and I think every professional photographer fails more than they succeed. I think I think that's true in any level of creativity. Every writer or every songwriter, produces more songs than they ever record, and has more versions that don't work out than the versions that eventually make it onto to be recorded. And I think that every one of those is a learning process, which makes the one that works. It's what makes it work. But in terms of stories, I remember years ago I went to Scotland, to the Isle of Skye, and I really wanted to photograph the Old Man of Storr, which is it's a very famous rock formation on the Isle of Skye, and it's a sunrise location because it faces east, and it's a bit of a hike. I can't remember exactly, but it's about an hour to walk up there, and it's generally quite a steep incline. And I set off at about 4 a.m. in the dark, on my own, and it was a bit miserable. It was wet and damp and raining.
This place you've
And
never
by the
been to.
I'd gone up there the previous afternoon
Oh, okay.
to scope out the scene, and then I sat there, and when the sun never came up, because basically the cloud cover was so low that I couldn't see more than, I don't know, like 20 feet in front of my face.
Oh no.
And I never even got to see, I couldn't even see it. And I just sat there, just thinking, why am I doing this? It was freezing cold, it was raining. What is the point of doing this? And then, it's very easy to get disheartened and just think, well, this was a complete waste of time. But then the next day you think it's to get up and you think, well, tomorrow will be better. So I'm going to get up and I'm going to do it again. So then the next day I got up, I get sunrise and got a great shot, not from the Old Manor store. I went to another location and got a shot that I was really happy with. But I don't think that really gets to the point of failure, what I was saying of learning from failure. I think it's just understanding that when you shoot something, you will often not get it quite right. I think, sometimes you do, but occasionally it takes a few attempts, and those attempts can happen within the same shoot. So you can be shooting something and then you realize, maybe if I go and stand over there and remove this rock from the composition, and that requires a level of awareness that what you're doing isn't working. And sometimes, you can stubbornly stick at something, and I've done this before. I think, no, this is going to work. This is going to work, and then I look back at the images, and I just think, no, what was I doing? It clearly didn't work. And then understanding that the reason that it didn't work is because that things weren't balancing. The elements weren't balancing within the frame, and that quite simply that there wasn't a shot there. There wasn't, what I was trying to do just was never going to work unless I'd moved somewhere else. And I think it's just understanding that and realizing that it doesn't matter if you fail and you understand that you failed, then you'll go and do it again, and you will learn from the failure. Hopefully, you'll learn that maybe you needed to compose it better. But beyond all of that, and this is what I think is most important, is the fact that it's just great to be there. Doing photography, and I think it's very easy to lose this, is when you get to a beautiful place, you can feel that if you haven't taken an image that captures that you failed, that there was no, but you haven't failed, you've gone to an amazing place. Actually, I've just remembered a very good example. The first time I tried to shoot the aurora, I failed completely, because when you shoot the aurora, the northern lights, usually you're in the pitch black and you can't see anything, so focusing the camera is a challenge. So if you're trying to shoot the aurora over a mountain, you usually can't see the mountain, so you're focusing blind. So what I made the mistake of doing was just setting the focus ring on the camera to infinity and thinking that'll be okay.
Should work.
But it's not, because most lenses are set up that when you shoot them at infinity, they're actually not set to infinity. You kind of have to go back a little bit. So shooting at infinity really gives you, shooting it where the lens tells you is at infinity, really gives you front to back sharpness. So pretty much all of the images that I shot of the aurora were a little bit out of focus. And there's initially this disappointment, God, it didn't work, damn. But I had a brilliant time. And this was what was most important, is that you can't let the photos or the lack of success in getting the photo define the experience, because being out there shooting the aurora is a privilege. It's a gift. I was so lucky to be able to do that, and it was such a pleasure to be standing in this place with this incredible light show going overhead. That in itself was a fantastic experience. And then there's the taking away the fact that it didn't work and thinking, okay, next time I'm going to get it right. Now, it would have been nice to have got it right the very first time. And I would have got images from it. But the reality is that, a year down the line, 2 years down the line, often, these things don't matter, because we don't need to have a great image of every single great experience that we have in life. That's not what makes life worth living. That's not what makes going out to shoot the landscapes important. What makes it important is going out there and being there and using the camera as a way of connecting with that experience, because I do find that shooting the landscape actually focuses you on the experience. It really, for me at least, it really enhances it. And if the image doesn't quite work out, then the experience is still an incredible one. And hopefully the next time I'll get it better. But I know that as I go through photography, I'll still make mistakes. You know, we still have a joke now that occasionally, the last time I was in Norway recently, I went out my first two Aurora shots, the first one Aurora shot. I forgot to take the lens cap off.
Oh,
and it sounds ridiculous,
Eddie.
but because it's so dark and you can't see anything, it's like, oh, right. Yeah. And then, everyone still does that thing where they, you're shooting at night, so you have the ISO set at 3,200, and then you go out the next sunrise and you're shooting the sunrise, and you've left the ISO at ISO high. And these things, I know that I don't do them very often anymore. I mean, it would make me sound incredibly incompetent. I think my competence has increased significantly, but there will still be mistakes. And I know that every professional photographer, because I partner with different people in workshops and stuff like that, still does these same things. Everyone does them, and no one gets it right and gets it perfect every time, all the time. And I think that's the thing to remember as a learner, is that, everyone is making mistakes and is continuing to make mistakes and is learning from those mistakes.
Next up, episode 141, where I interviewed Marc Hemmings. Marc Hemmings, as you remember, is a travel photographer. So I asked Derek to give me his thoughts. And Derek said, after listening to episode 141 with Marc Hemmings about 3 times, I kept on rewinding to the same parts. What really stuck out to me was him talking about hiding aspects of a subject so that the person viewing the photo will have to use their imagination. Marc's quote here, what we're trying to do is allow our viewer to have more activation of their imagination. And this is the primary way that we increase the visual value of our photos. Another quote, whenever we can have foreground elements, our framing devices, that package our subject together, we actually produce a more visually appealing image. And the last quote here, if we don't create value for our viewer is going to walk away. Derek then says, out of the 141 plus episodes that I've listened to, this 20-minute section may have been my favorite and possibly most impactful. Derek, once again, fantastic takeaways, and I thank you so much for taking the time to, not only give me those takeaways, but also those direct quotes. So, Derek, thank you. Everybody else, let's listen in to Marc. Okay, so I want to talk about, I remember this time, and when I was coming up with the questions for this interview, I was trying to think about vacation photos that I took in the past. Recently, I went out to Arizona to visit my mom, and when I was growing up, she made scrapbooks all the time. And I was going through some of those photos, and I realized, how bad these vacation photos were. And it reminded me of this time when I was in 4th grade, when one of my classmates, his name was Irvin, he took a road trip with his family to Mount Rushmore. And when he got back, we all had to sit through a slide presentation of this 9-year-old's photos of like the road and Mount Rushmore, and it was like so far away in these photos that everybody was just bored to tears. So
yes,
what are some signs of amateur travel photography so that we can avoid them and not bore our friends and family?
Oh, I'm glad you asked, because if I can help anybody with this, then the world of slideshow entertainment is going to skyrocket.
Perfect.
Because all of us have sat through, for example, let's say that a friend or a family member goes to Europe and they get 60 photos of the European churches. Well, the churches are beautiful, but after the 5th picture, it's just another boring church.
We get it, yeah.
So what I advise people to do is to actually hide the primary subject. So in art theory or the lingo of photography, the primary subject is that which is the most visually important. So let's say it's the church. A secondary subject is usually something that supports the primary subject. Now, sometimes a secondary subject could actually frame the primary subject. Let me give you an example. Let's think of that European church. No, let's actually go to the Taj Mahal. Now, everybody photographs the Taj Mahal who goes to India. However, if you only allow a little bit of the Taj Mahal to be viewed, because it's framed with a silhouette of those sort of an area that has arches, or it's hidden partially by a really interesting object on the grounds. Or let's go back to the European church. Maybe only the spire of the church is visible because you've hid it behind other buildings that are out of focus. What we're always trying to do is allow our viewer to have more activation of their imagination. And this is a primary way that we increase the visual value of our photos. So if we think of a snapshot of that European church as a documentary shot, okay, it's okay as it is, no problem. But if we want to go from documentary to fine art, or from documentary to really good travel photography, it's usually the case that we're going to alter the environment to not fully show the subject. So that could be nighttime. You could photograph the church at the nighttime where we only see certain elements that are lit up. We could move ourselves so we only capture a small glimpse of the church. Or we could really do something different if we have the drone, photograph from an aerial perspective. We're always trying to hide the primary subject to an extent that the imagination of the viewer is activated.
Okay, this is a really interesting concept. I'm trying to picture it in my head, because if I think of a European church, I have not been to Europe, but I know that they're very large. They're typically in some sort of square with lots of space around. So how is hiding the photo? I understand that it's adding the excuse me, like adding a portion of the viewer's imagination, right? Like for them to explore that, to enjoy the photo. How much of this should we be doing? How much should we be hiding?
I understand.
I went to, so go ahead.
What I try to do myself, like say for example, we have the beautiful church and we have 2 trees that are going to frame up the spire really nicely. Those trees are acting as what we'd call a foreground element. Okay, so the trees are hiding the church, but we still see 20 or 30% of the church surface.
Okay.
It's just that we don't see the whole church. And these trees are framing devices, or like I said, the foreground element. And whenever we can have foreground elements or framing devices that package our subject together, we actually produce a more visually appealing image. Think of fashion photography or car photography. Now, whenever we see a new picture of a Lamborghini or maybe a McLaren, these are beautiful works of art. I guarantee you that you will not see every element of the car. Car photographers are brilliant. They will photograph and light this beautiful car so that you're only seeing about 30 or 40% of the surface area. The rest is black. It's all in carefully arranged shadows. And you see these beautiful lights and really low to the ground. The imagination has to kick in somewhere. And whenever we see a full image of the primary subject, we run the risk of losing interest in the viewer. If we hide some parts of the primary subject because of unique use of shadow or foreground elements or framing, it's incredible how much more visual value that image has, because the viewer's imagination is engaged. What is the one thing that we want our viewers to do when they see our photos?
Say, wow, that's a beautiful photo.
Or a disturbing photo, or an interesting photo, or any type of emotion, but we have
a reaction. Yes.
We have to have a reaction. Now, one of the great ways in getting that reaction is by providing mystery, confusion, drama, metaphor, narrative. These are all devices that we as photographers really need to infuse in our images to take our images from just a standard snapshot into a work of art?
Okay. Let me think about this. I love this idea. Adding, I guess we're not adding more context to the photo. We're adding just more intrigue when we do these things to add that interest. So if we are on a family vacation, okay,
Yep.
we're thinking of, Europe, we go to these nice places, we want to show off specific things. These
Mhm.
things are great. If we're in a family atmosphere
Yeah.
around other people, what sorts of things can we be doing to add that intrigue and interest?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Now, family shots, like for example, I have two systems. I shoot with an iPhone, and also, of course, my Fuji. And if it's just a standard snapshot that I'm not really caring about anything deep, no narrative, no metaphor, no poetry, then just a standard snapshot of my friends and my family in front of that church is perfectly fine. However,
Mhm.
in order to, if I really want to if I have the time, then I'll do fun stuff like forced perspective with my kids. They love doing that. Have you ever seen that where one of the kids is holding on to the church steeple? Well, the church steeple
Right.
is maybe, who knows, 60 feet high, but there
Mhm.
she is holding on to the top. These are fun things that will take our potentially boring family snapshots and allowing them to be appealing to both this generation and future generations down the road. Another thing is when you're photographing with your family and you're in these wonderful spots, well, try scale. Like, try to have your son or your daughter or your mom or your dad so small in the picture that they are dwarfed by the sheer scale of the massive Colosseum or the
Mhm.
the huge church or whatever. Essentially, or change your angle. Essentially, we're always trying to avoid the 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 elevation that 99% of all photography is taken. Here's a quiz for you. What height in feet, because you're American, what height in feet are 99% of all photos taken?
Like 5'7", like eye level. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. Whatever the average height of people are, that is the normal height of all
Mhm.
photography. So if we want to get into the 1%, what do we have to do?
We either go up or we either go down.
Exactly. So that is the key. And why do you feel that not many people take those low shots from the ground shooting up, which are always very interesting?
Just because it's a little bit more work.
Exactly. It's because it's uncomfortable.
Okay.
Yeah, to get down on your knees, and it's not comfortable to do that. That's why everyone avoids it. But if we as photographers want to really instill interesting elements into our images, we have to do things like, put our hand up really high to photograph shooting down, or to get really low and to shoot from a lower perspective, which actually empowers our primary subject. So if it's a person, it makes them appear grander and more important, and that's a good thing.
Now we got interview 149 with photographer Sara Blanco. This was a fun one for me. So I asked Sean to take a listen and Mara to take a listen and tell me what they thought. So here was their takeaway. The majority of Sarah's answers were focused on telling stories and being emotionally supportive to your clients. How to create that emotion. She gives an exceptional answer. And then yours, so me, Raymond, and her answers are really good. Pretty much says, don't be a robot as a photographer. Yeah, I mean, photography is not only a service, but it's a service for other humans. And being that robot sometimes doesn't always work out. We as humans have a natural aversion to robots because, that movie Terminator and the idea of them taking over the world. But the more that you can be a human, the better your photography is going to be and the better that you're going to be able to connect with somebody. So here is that snippet from Sara right now. I usually start off the podcast by just starting off with the beginning, right?
Okay.
Where did it start for you? I want to know how you got started in photography.
Well, it was a million years ago.
You look great for a million years old.
I try. No, I was 17, and I was working as a receptionist at a hair salon, and loving the environment of being the greeter for people and meeting new people and getting to know new people. And I got the opportunity to start managing a studio. I basically was taking over the position for someone who was going on maternity leave. And so at 17, I started managing photography studios.
Wow.
Yeah, it was kind of crazy, but what I loved about that position was that, again, I was kind of thrown into it as the person that everybody saw, the first person that people talked to. I helped brides design their books. I helped moms order photographs. I did everything. So for me, my first introduction into photography was dealing with people and really like discovering my love for working with people and getting to know all kinds of different people. And that was from there. I managed studios for about, I would say, 2 different studios, one 3 years, one 6 years. And then I started my business when I was 24, full time. Well, when I was second shooting weddings, it was a lot of what she wanted me to do. So it was standing where she needed me to be, capturing what she needed. Once I started really shooting for myself, I kind of did everything differently than she preferred. And I don't know if it was because I just had a different style, but I don't know. I would just play. When you're photographing a child, what do you want to see with that child? You want to see everything. You want to remember everything. You want to remember, one of my very favorite first images that I took was of my niece, and she was 2 years old, completely insane, like the most hyper child you have ever met.
I would challenge you, but okay, I get it.
She was fire all the time. And so I loved photographing her because she challenged everybody with whatever they said, but with me especially, because she knew I was trying so hard to like practice photography, and she would just take off running. And so one of my very favorite images that I took of her, I was trying to get a portrait of her looking up at me. And so I had my camera, and she ran past me and looked up. And I somehow got it in focus at the perfect time when she was looking up at me. And that whole little series that I did of her was one of my favorites. It was her standing on her tiptoes, looking up at touching a gate. It was her hands. It was her. So I kind of just played with a million different angles that told a story about that 10 minutes we spent in her front yard. So it was the ground is the background, the fence is the background, her feet, her hands. And so just getting, a million different compositions and ways of photographing her that really told a story. So I think that at the end of the day, that's all I'm trying to do, is tell a story.
Why don't you share right now, when you're photographing families, how do you create that emotion? How do you create that interaction between your families?
So a lot of it comes from just being a mother myself and knowing the effort that has gone into this family even meeting me. There's convincing dad most of the time, convincing dad to show up and be happy about it. So for me, just being very, very present with my clients, talking to them beforehand about what the expectations are of me, what they want to see from me, the way that I work when I'm working with a family, kind of giving them a little bit of insight into what is going on in my mind while I'm shooting them.
So just making sure that they are prepared and that they understand that they're kind of along with you in this journey.
Yes, exactly. And also me, myself, showing up ready and being vulnerable, being just 100% there for them. This isn't for me. This is for them. And so I'm an observer. I really like to watch people, watch the way that they interact, and it sounds kind of weird, but kind of read their energy. Like from the minute they get out of the car, you can tell how dad's feeling.
Oh, yes, you sure can.
You can see how dad's feeling. You can you can hear kind of the frazzledness in mom's voice, trying to make everybody happy and just like make this all go smoothly. She's usually already apologizing for one of the children being in a mood or something. So for me to just show up and be like, immediately try to just make them happy. And like, this is going to be so fun. And let me tell you about this butterfly I saw in the field. And dad, how was that traffic? Are you doing okay? Like just trying to immediately break down their barriers without being like a force. You want to be a gentle force with your people, right? You want to let them be comfortable and let them be vulnerable. And how do you do that? You have to be that yourself first. So really just creating an energy with them among us of just happiness and love. And I'm not stressed out. Your kid is screaming his head off, but that's okay because we're going to play over here for a minute while you handle that. And don't worry, it is perfectly fine. And just really creating an environment where they can be themselves. I do give prompts. I do direct quite a bit, but really it's a direction, it's a prompt, and then it's stepping back to let them be normal, be themselves.
Here we have episode 157, my interview with Marc Silber. I asked Magda to listen to this interview, and she said that her biggest takeaway was the one that sticks out, where we both talk about how everyone is creative in their own way, and that you simply have to find it and work hard at it. That's totally true, Magda. As you hear here, I left a good amount of this interview in, as creativity is such a hard thing, and I hope that others can take away what you did from this as well. What do you think are some other misconceptions that people have about creativity?
You know, Raymond, I think the most common misconception is I'm not creative. Some people are. You're born creative. You're born with a paintbrush in your hand. You know, Pablo Picasso, it's like he must have been a great artist from age 2. Or, Chase Jarvis was a stellar photographer and had no hardships or whatever. Or Chris Burkhardt, it just became an overnight success if you're familiar with him on Instagram. But let's take Chris as an example. He said it was a lot of work. It was like a 10-year overnight success.
Yeah.
And you work hard at it and you persevere. And I think the most common misconception is some people have it and some people don't. And I don't believe that's true. And a number of my guests said the same thing. I believe everyone has some area that they can be creative in. And let's expand the idea of what creativity means. It doesn't just mean being a great photographer. It could be in any form of art, including life itself. I believe that, somebody who's a great cook, that's creative, obviously. You're making something, which is what creativity means. You're creating something out of raw material. And you're using your imagination to put it together, which is what you do with a photograph, or you do with a painting, or you do with decorating your house. So the key, I believe, is this. Find your passion, find your area of creativity and roll with it. And then just expand from there and know that you do have the ability to be creative no matter what it is. So that to me is the most common misconception.
I love that. And I want to share a personal anecdote real quick.
Yeah.
And that's every year I have a pretty short wedding season. I don't like to book too early. I don't like to shoot too late. And I always find that I'll have a good year. And then come, May, when it's time to start shooting again, I feel really, really rusty. And when I get out there and start shooting, it's nowhere near as good as the photos that I take towards the end of the year, like October, when I've done that practice, when I've put in the work, and when I've, just made that time to be doing more photography. So I can vouch for that statement right there, is that you're either born with it or you're not, because in May I would say, oh, what am I doing? Like, people are going to find out I'm a fraud. But in October, I'm like, I'm feeling good. Like, I need to be doing more of this. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's interesting because that kind of ties in with the whole cycle of creativity that I go over, which might be a good point to just touch upon that.
Absolutely.
So at the starting point, at the center, which actually never ends, is the idea of visualization, which is your vision for whatever it is you want to create. If you're a wedding photographer, you have some vision of the wedding. You have some idea of who you're going to take photographs of. You have a shot list. You have a style that you've already visualized that maybe you've talked over with the couple. That's your visualization. Ansel Adams said it's the most, or he actually said it's the key to a photograph. So he was somebody who talked about visualization all the time, because if you just press the shutter without visualizing first, you're missing that whole artistic process. You become a recorder. Yeah, you're snapshotting and you're recording rather than creating. The second step in the creative process is knowing your tools. And what you described is, if you're a little rusty, you got to kind of get back into gear with your tools, right? And we all have to do that. Unfortunately, you leave something sit there on the shelf for a while, and you got to get back into the groove of it.
Absolutely.
But knowing your tools is incredibly important. Bob Holmes said, don't let the camera get in the way of your photography.
I love that.
And, we've all had that happen. We've had the camera get in the way of our photographs. So you got to know your camera so well that it doesn't get in the way. Then you work your craft. You get into production. You do whatever it is, whether it's photography or shooting film or writing a book. It's just work. It's a job. Not in a bad way, but you have to look at it like that. Writing a book, you have to sit down every day and write. If every day you don't write, the book doesn't write itself.
Wouldn't that be nice?
It would be nice. Photographs don't take themselves. You take them. So it's making sure you have a schedule, a work schedule, and overcoming the biggest barrier that I believe the biggest excuse would be time.
Yeah.
And I devote a whole chapter to overcoming that barrier. But from there, you edit and you refine. We all have to, obviously, I never let a photograph go anywhere without editing it in some way. I'm sure you're the same way.
Oh, yeah.
It doesn't go on Instagram from my camera.
Yeah.
It goes via Lightroom and then it goes to Instagram. But editing has all sorts of different forms to it. There's editing in terms of how to put a body of work together. There's editing your writing. There's editing even your life, cutting out those things that are distracting. Yesterday, I gave advice to somebody, and I said, how many hours a day are you watching TV or playing video games? And it was a fairly sizable number. I said, why don't you invest 3 of those hours into learning your skills instead of that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's just common advice I would give anyone. Take that time that you don't feel you have because you're using it for something you really don't need to do. It's an investment. So invest it wisely, just like you want to invest money wisely. And then finally, after you've edited, then you're going to share it with others. And that's the final part of the creative process. And it doesn't mean giving it away for free. It means putting it out there to the world in some form, whether it's putting it on your wall, a print, that's nicely framed, or putting it in a book, or putting it in an exhibit, or in a case of wedding photographers, obviously you're sharing it back to the bride and groom and the family, but you're getting it back to the world. You're giving it back to the world. And if you get paid for it, so much the better.
All right. I love that. So next we have my interview with Dan Milner, episode 161. So I reached out and I asked Michael to give me his thoughts on this episode. What he said that his takeaway about Dan's views on social media and how it affects his mentality and business is very old school. As I listened, I couldn't help but think of the old man yelling at kids to get off his lawn. But he makes a really good point of how much time and energy social media takes out of you. Michael says, I don't even have a business or do photography as a job, and social media is a big slice of my day. But his refusal to partake in Instagram and Facebook is both liberating and daunting. I feel like the only way he's still able to sell his photography is because he already had those connections established before social media was born. And I wonder if he would be able to do so now without those connections. That is a really good question there, Michael. I'm glad that you were able to, not only get something out of it, but then think about that next step. I also asked Amanda to listen to this episode, and Amanda said, I think my biggest takeaway personally was just regarding social media. It is such a dangerous slope to becoming addicted, and I think we will begin to see a lot more people waking up in regards to that. It really made me want to rethink my photography business and my approach to photography as a whole. Best episode yet. Amanda, that is so awesome. And for you listening, if you weren't able to get to 161, let's go ahead and listen into that snippet right now. I wasn't going to get into this for a few more questions, but is this one of the reasons why you are, according to your website, you believe that social media, that you are a complete and total non-believer of social media, and that these platforms have done irreparable damage to human communication skills and attention span?
Geez, did I say that?
Yeah. Well, whoever wrote the copy on your website did.
That sounds negative. Yeah. In essence, I believe exactly that. But there's a little background here. So I don't like social media. I think things like Instagram are proving themselves to be one of the most detrimental contributions to our society that I think I've ever seen. I always kind of joke with my friends, I'm not sure that as a species we will survive Instagram. You know, it's unleashing a level of consumerism on the planet that we simply can't sustain. It's unleashing a battle against the environment that we can't sustain or can't win. But this goes way back. So, and here's the ironic part, is that I was one of the first people that I know in the entire world to be on Facebook. Mm-hmm. I went to New York to do an assignment, and it was for someone that had something to do with the Central Park Committee. So I'm talking to her in New York, and she says Facebook, and I'm like, what's that? And she goes, oh, this is new thing called Facebook. When you get back to California, you should sign up for it. And so I'm like, okay. I fly back to California. I sign up on Facebook. No one I know is on Facebook. Not a single person. It's just me. And I'm on there, and there's other people on there, and I'm like, hey, this is kind of cool. And same thing when Instagram happens. I'm walking down the street in San Francisco. A friend of mine calls me and goes, hey, there's this new thing called Instagram. You should check it out. I stop in the middle of the street. I download the app, and I start taking pictures and posting on Instagram. So I was on these things long before any of my friends were on there, including all my friends who are basically given their entire life to these platforms. But 6 years ago, I was here in New Mexico. My birthday's January 1st. I woke up on my birthday, and I was like, I don't believe in this anymore. This is not what we were originally sold of what this is. I said, I am watching these networks destroy my friends. They are like skittish, scared little creatures who can't get through a conversation without looking at their phone. They're insecure. Their work has gone downhill, and the work they're producing is only being produced to try to drive numbers on these social networks. And it's garbage because it looks like everybody else's. It looks like Instagram content. So I called the founder of Blurb, and I called the marketing director at Blurb, who was my immediate boss at the time. And I said, I know this probably isn't going to go over well, but I'm deleting 7 networks right now, and I don't ever want to go back on these networks. And the marketing director said at the time, she said, I hate them too. I think this is all, go ahead. So I thought, oh, that's great. And then the founder said, go ahead and do it, but write about why it is you're doing it. Yeah. And so I did, and I did a post called Why I Deleted Social Media, which is by far the highest traffic post I've ever done. And
look at you, paying attention to those numbers.
Well, it's because here's something funny happened. So 2 weeks goes by, and I went through detox. Yeah. I would literally, in moments of like calm,
just pick up your phone just to look at it.
The first thing, I just pick it up for no reason. And I'd be in the field shooting, and I'd go, oh, I should check like Facebook. As I'm walking down the street somewhere trying to shoot, I'd be thinking about Instagram, and I thought, this is bad. So 2 weeks detox, and then after 2 weeks, I kind of came through the veil, and I looked back, and I thought, man, it's not good. So I wrote a post. The post got all this traffic. I don't know the specific numbers, but it was by far more than any post I've done. Mm-hmm. But something funny happened. It's kind of tragic, is that people began to write me asking for help. They were saying, I'm physically addicted. I lost my house. I lost my job. I lost my family. I can't stay off of Facebook. I'm on Instagram 60 hours a week. I'm nervous. I'm unhappy. I'm taking depression medication. So I had to write a follow-up post and saying, I'm not a medical person. I'm not a psychiatrist. If you need medical help, please seek medical attention or psychiatric help. But that's not my role. I'm just not qualified to help in that way. That post was 6 years ago. I get emails every week from people all over the world saying, "Help me, help. I can't get out." And that's one of the things that's very interesting to me is that I think all of us are probably touched by someone in our family or close to our families that has substance abuse problem, right? Either alcohol, drugs, whatever. And people are pretty. It's pretty easy for people to say, "Yeah, that's an addiction. It's too bad. Get help, whatever." Then you move down the scale and you come to things like sex and gambling, and you go, "Well, I'm a sex addict," or I'm a gambling addict, and there's a lot less people that want to say, "Yep, those are legitimate addictions." There's a lot of people that go, "Well, those are just choices. You should just stop." Then you slide down the scale even further and you get to technology, and there are so few people who want to admit that something like Instagram is a physical addiction. But it is. It is a dopamine physical addiction. And I have seen it ruin so many of my friends who are photographers whose their entire existence is based on that app. And it's nuts. I don't want any part of it. So I deleted all my accounts, and then about 4 years later, the marketing director at Blurb at the time said to me, "It would really help us if you had an Instagram account." And I said, "Never going to happen. I'm never going to do that." And so about 15 minutes later, I'm sitting right next to her. She says, "I just created an account in your name. Don't worry about it. We will manage it." And I said, "Okay." And so 2 days goes by, and I'm like, I better look at what they're putting on there because it has my name on it. And it's not their fault, but they don't know me, they're not intimate with me as a photographer. They don't know my philosophy. And so the work they were putting on, the captions, the style, the look of it, I said, "No, I can't do this." So I started managing the account, and then that lasted until I guess about 6 or 8 months ago. And I thought, why am I doing this? I don't like anything about this. I don't think it's helping Blurb really in particular. So I quit posting, and I haven't heard anything. So,
but now they're going to hear this interview and go back and look. Hey, wait a second. Dan hasn't posted in a while.
Why are you not posting?
Yeah.
But I think anyone who gives themselves 2 weeks away from social, I think you'll be amazed, because if you can survive 2 weeks cold turkey, no access, no sneaking peeks, no nothing. If you do 2 weeks, you will look back and you will see it in a very different light. And I can almost guarantee that it's going to make you at least take pause to, one, how much time you're putting in, and two, how fake it is, how phony the entire thing is. There's a big difference between being a good photographer and being someone who knows how to build following. Yeah. Those are both legitimate skills. Absolutely. Building a following is a legitimate skill because it can give you the freedom and independence to operate on your own. But don't confuse the fact of someone with a big following is a good photographer, because very often those two things do not overlap.
In episode 164, I interviewed Dave Mays, host of the Polar Pro Golden Hour podcast, and I asked Saul in the Facebook group to give me his biggest takeaway, and he said that his biggest takeaway was keeping the shutter speed at 180 degrees when shooting video. I was lost when he said that and broken at the time, but here I am, a semi-professional shooter, and only knew shutter settings by the name of 1/100th of a second or 1/2000th of a second. Boy, was I blown away at that concept. I just filmed a video for my YouTube channel, and the first thing I did was adjust my shutter to get my exposure, facepalm. I had no idea the video infraction I was causing. It completely makes sense. I can't wait to try this and see the result in my upcoming video recordings. So yeah, this was a really technical interview with Dave, and he is a video shooter. But, as you mentioned, there's a lot in here about exposure as well that directly applies to photography. So let's go ahead and listen in.
Yeah, so when I first started shooting video, and again, I'm going to just preface, I know this is a photography podcast, but I do have this video perspective. So I think this can still apply to photographers, but
exposure is exposure.
Also, I think if there's any photographers listening who maybe want to start doing video, some of these things that I'll share will be helpful. One of the main things for me with exposure that I learned with the DSLRs especially was just do not overexpose. Like if you overexpose that highlight that's in the skies, like those are gone forever. You can't bring them back. Now, obviously, if you're a photographer and you're shooting a raw image and you do overexpose a little bit, there is a little bit of range there with the raw file that you can pull back in Lightroom. But I never had that luxury because I'm essentially shooting a JPEG, you know, with the video, with the MOV file. So I would actually expose slightly under because I found for video, it was easier to kind of boost those levels up in post-production than it is to pull down those highlights.
Sure.
And one of the big mistakes that I made early on, and I don't know if it's a mistake, if it's just something that was necessary with our quick run and gun shooting, but with video, your shutter speed is actually supposed to stay locked at 180 degrees, which is a filmmaking term. Back when the celluloid, when the film would go through the camera, the shutter would actually do a full 180 degree flip on each frame of that film. And so if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, for example, which is like the cinema standard, you need to be shooting at 1/48th of a second to have proper motion blur. When you look at your hand moving in front of your face, there's a natural blur that our eyeballs see. It's not a jittery, sharp image when I move my hand back and forth. So cameras need to have that same kind of look and aesthetic. It's very subtle. It's something most people can't even pick up. And when I was starting out, I was actually adjusting my exposure using the shutter. So I was jacking up the shutter to like 1/1000th of a second, and I was shooting at 24 frames per second, and that's fine.
Look like
honestly,
Saving Private Ryan.
Exactly. There's a lot of people who don't even notice it, but when you see it, once you learn it, it's wrong. It's incorrect. It's not the right way to shoot. And so that's where an ND filter comes into play, because essentially when you're shooting video, you want to shoot exactly double of whatever your frame rate is. So if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you need to be shooting at 1/160th of a second. If you're shooting at 24, you need to be shooting at 1/48th of a second. If you're shooting at 120 slow-mo, a lot of people don't know this, if you're shooting slow-mo shots, you actually have to jack your shutter up to 2/50th or technically 2/40th of a second. And in a lot of cases, if you're shooting low-light slow-mo, if you're cranking your shutter double 120, 240, that 2/40th of a second cuts a lot of light, so you have to have light. So anyways, an ND filter or a variable ND filter can come into play there and can really help. And I started using just straight ND filters using a magnetic adapter called the Zoom adapter. It's spelled XUME.
Mm-hmm.
I just invested the money, bought a set of 77 millimeter filters, and I adapted all my lenses to that. Because essentially the largest lens that you own should be whatever filter size you own, and then all the smaller ones just adapt up. That way you don't have to buy a bunch of filters. So I got adapters, and I put these little magnetic adapters on every lens I owned. I only owned 3 lenses at the time. I think it was like a telephoto or like a 50, the Sigma 18-35 1.8, which is amazing,
for crop
and then
sensors.
the Tokina 11-16, which is another great crop sensor lens.
Next up, we have episode 165, my interview with Hannah Chia. So I asked Ashley to give me her thoughts, and what Ashley said was, my favorite part of the podcast is when she mentions that she's still using an older Nikon camera to this day. It is inspiring that she's able to capture beautiful, sharp images with such an old camera body. And Omar as well, I got his take. He said that he was taken away by the part that she uses only natural light for her photography. It really threw me off completely. I just can't imagine how to work without speedlights or monolights for that matter. Omar, Ashley, awesome stuff, awesome takeaways. Let's go ahead and hear those 2 pieces right now. So you said earlier that you just had a digital camera. Was that already a DSLR, and is that what you started shooting with?
Yes, it was a DSLR. I got it off of another student. We had like this student selling stuff Facebook page.
Very cool.
And so it's a pretty old model. Actually, it's still the one that I'm using now. And it was like the body, just the camera body. And so I started researching, what kind of lens should I use for food photography? And so I decided to get like a prime lens, which was pretty cheap too. Yeah, so that was the camera body used, and then I got a prime lens specifically for food photography.
And you said that you're still using that camera body?
Yes, I still am.
Could you tell me what camera it is?
Yeah, it's a Nikon D90.
Okay, yeah. So that is an older body, but that's fantastic. No, this is what I love to hear. So many people think that obviously, gear is what makes the photos, and here is proof that this, I believe it's like a 6 or 7 year old camera, the D90 is, and yet you're able to create these fantastic images. And as you said, it's all in the glass and playing with light and stuff. That's awesome. So what was the struggle, right? So once you learned what aperture, shutter speed, and ISO were, even though you were using settings from other photographers, where was that struggle? And I guess how did you overcome that?
It was just a lot of trial and error, I think. And it helped that I had a very consistent lighting setup. So I just picked a spot. It was in my old apartment in Houston, but it was just a really nice window. And it was kind of like a diffused light because there's a tree outside the window kind of blocking direct sunlight. And so I had really good lighting. And I think that for me was the key. And that's when my photography started getting a lot better, was just figuring out, okay, this is the lighting that I have. And I think honestly for food photography or any photography in general, lighting is just critical. And then it was after that I set up the lighting, or I set up the, I guess, camera where it was, and then figuring out what were the best settings. And so I started using manual mode, and I think I just bumped down the aperture really a lot lower so I could get more of like that depth of field in the background. Yeah, so it was a lot of trial and error, essentially.
All right, as a bonus, I said that there was 10 interviews, 10 takeaways from this interview, and surprise, there is an 11th. So one of my favorite interviews of the year was actually with Chris Owens, who is the manager photographer of the IMS here in Indianapolis, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and he is in charge of photographing the Indianapolis 500. And this was really the first time that I talked to a photographer who would shoot something of this magnitude and kind of had all the weight on himself and had to think about it more from a critical standpoint, right? As photographers, sometimes we just go out and we just do our own thing. Even talking with photographers who have, shot the Super Bowl or other big sporting events, it's still them, right? Chris has multiple photographers under him, and it's a whole production. So hearing his take was so much fun. But I think the biggest takeaway for me was simply his drive and his passion and how he got there. So in this little snippet right here that I'm going to share, he shares exactly how, you can be the most valuable person. How if you showed up, if you became a photo assistant tomorrow, how you can get to where he is and just be helpful. So here is my favorite takeaway of 2019 with Chris Owens. We're kind of winding down here. I got a few last questions for you. You've been super gracious with your time. I want to know, what is something that you think most people don't realize about shooting an event like the Indianapolis 500?
It's a great question. I think the thing that I find a lot with photographers is probably this. It's a little generic, but on the racing side of it, catching the cars. People see these awesome images that my teammates and myself make, and I think a good photographer thinks, I can go out there and do that. Some of it you can, but some of it's like I'm not really great at, and I've been working at it for years. So,
do you have an example?
I would say more of the blurry stuff, the creative pans you see. If you see these cool pictures of race cars and there's blur everywhere and these neat colors coming off the side of the wall, or because a fence is in the way or whatever, a good photographer can go out and get that stuff, and they still would come back with a big blurry messes. It's a very, very thin line between making a blurry photo creative and a blurry photo a blurry bad photo.
Yeah.
So I would say that I find, and I say that because I've known a couple photographers who have literally done that. We've had come out and said, hey, I want to try to help you for the day or whatever. And they kind of come back saying like, hey, that's way harder than I thought it was. Just because, like I said, the fine line between a blurry creative photo and a blurry, bad, crummy photo, it's a fine line. I'm trying to find it. I'm close to it. I don't know right where it is, but I can always tell which side of it I'm on. So I would say that. I think people, like you mentioned earlier, don't realize sometimes the hours put in on and the commitment involved to event like the Indy 500 or any big event, a horse race or anything like that you have to cover, of being there at 4 or 5 a.m. before all the people flood in and the traffic is too full and you get stuck out on the highway. Stuff like that. Standing, like you had mentioned, standing on your feet the entire day, staying alert, not getting bored, not losing focus. And, every time you go to take a shot, just realizing that whatever obstacles or resistance you have inside you that's telling you I'm too tired, I need a break, I'll be fine with what I got already. Things like that. That's just resistance, and that's keeping you from having great portfolio images, and it's keeping you from your next paycheck or even extending your hobby or one day creating your career in photography. Resistance. Just that's what people don't realize. There's a lot of resistance in what I do. Get tired, get sore, get hungry, get bored. There's a lot. You just really got to stay on it, for lack of a better term.
So my last question for you was going to be, if you showed up tomorrow and you had a new assistant, which obviously you would know about because you would be the one in charge of finding them. But so let's say you showed up to work tomorrow and there was a brand new assistant there for you. What is the one piece of advice that you would give them? But would it be that? Would it be persistence?
I would say, to not resist whenever something great comes to you or when you get tired or whenever you start losing focus. I would also tell them the greatest way, to be at the top of this is to be there, to be present, to volunteer, to raise your hand, to be the one to get up and go do something when it's needed by another photographer. Being helpful. I know that's so generic, but I feel that was the way I got, to the point where I'm at. Who can go shoot the sponsor event in the tent? Me. Did I want to? No. I hated it. I didn't want to do it, but I guess I just figured out that if you're helpful, by being helpful is the way is a great reason for people to use you. As generic as that sounds. You got to pay your dues in photography. You have to. And I know a lot of photographers, you hear them say things like, oh, never work for free, blah, blah, blah. If I wouldn't have worked for free, I would never be doing what I'm doing because I had no portfolio. You're not the greatest when you first start with your brand new digital camera. You have to have a reason to be good. And the best I would tell this person is also to shoot, because the way I feel that I got to be a good photographer is by always volunteering and doing all this stuff. So I'm always the one shooting while everybody's sitting around. So, and you figure things out. There's no school. There's nothing that can really, there's small things that can help you, but nothing can teach you to be a better photographer, nothing and no one than yourself by just going out and shooting and figuring it out. So I would say a lot of shooting, find what your interests are, volunteer for, if you're new, if you're an advanced photographer, I get it. But if you're a new photographer, maybe you're not ready to be taking money from clients and people. But if you are working with people who are taking money from clients and are working professionals, you're getting to watch what they do. You're getting to learn from them. And one day you're going to be in their shoes. It's not going to be next month. It's not going to be next year. It's not going to be the following. But you never know. You may, 5 years down the road, you might go, wow, I've been shooting a couple of events or a couple of portrait sessions volunteering for years, I got this now. I know all the trials and tribulations of it. I've seen the problems. I've seen the pros, the cons, and I know how to get through it and get over it. That's kind of what I feel about myself. You know, I've learned a lot in what I've done from others, and I can take that to do whatever I end up doing eventually. You know, whether it's here shooting car racing forever or doing anything else. So I would just say, shoot. You got to shoot a lot, and you got to volunteer to shoot.
It all comes back to persistence. Yeah, that's incredible. That was like a roadmap for, no pun intended, but that was like a roadmap to like getting where you want to get to, like from the beginning. That was wonderful. Oh man, I love that so much. And with that, guess what? We wrap up 2019. 2019, man. We're done. This is a year that I will never forget. I will, in fact, always remember it as one of the best years of my life, and a year that I hope helped you make strides in just being the photographer that you want to be. So I will join you again in 2020 with the first episode of the year, which is going to be the 3 biggest lessons that you need to learn to grow as a photographer in 2020. So until next week, have a happy new year.
Thank you for listening to the Beginner Photography Podcast. If you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review in iTunes. Keep shooting, and we'll see you next week.